My niece confessed her feelings, and now I'm lost. Part 2, the Midnight Confession. Hey Reddit. Here I am again, still in a daze from what happened. I appreciate everyone who reached out last time with advice. It's kept me grounded more than I thought it would. But honestly, I'm still barely holding it together. I've been lying awake at night, reliving every moment of that night, wondering if I did the right thing or if I just buried a secret that could change everything. I keep telling myself that this was just one weird experience that'll fade, but it feels like it's becoming a part of me, something I can't shake. Part 1, the setup. For those who missed the last post, here's a quick recap. I'm a 26-year-old guy who recently went to my parents' place for a vacation. I needed a break, a place where I could just kick back, leave work and stress behind, and get back to being myself. My family home has always been my safe haven, a place where I could drop all my pretenses and just be. The plan was simple: a couple of lazy weeks, some beers, some home-cooked meals, and time to reconnect with family. What I didn't know was that I'd be walking into a situation that would turn everything upside down. My 18-year-old niece was there, and seeing her after all this time felt like I was looking at a stranger. She was no longer the shy kid I remembered. She'd grown into a woman, one who exuded a confidence I didn't know how to handle. My parents had always been protective of her, especially after my brother's divorce. She'd had a rough few years, bouncing between households, dealing with the fallout of her parents' split. I guess I thought of her as fragile, like she was still the little girl I used to see running around in pigtails. But the moment I saw her, it hit me hard: she wasn't a kid anymore. She had this presence about her, something magnetic, almost unsettling. I chalked it up to the natural awkwardness of seeing a family member grow up, but as the days went on, it became clear that there was something more to this. I wasn't prepared for what was coming. Part 2, the awkward arrival. The day I arrived, I was exhausted from the drive. It was hot as hell, and I just wanted to sink into the comfort of home, grab a beer, and forget about the outside world. My mom greeted me at the door, practically dragging me inside, smothering me in one of those hugs that only moms give. My dad followed, slapping me on the back, and my brother was there too, already grinning with a beer in hand. The whole scene felt perfect, like the family reunions you see in movies. We were laughing, catching up, and I could feel myself relaxing, letting go of the stress that had been weighing me down for months. And then, my niece walked in. She was wearing a casual, fitted dress that hugged her in all the right places, and I almost didn't recognize her. She wasn't the shy kid I remembered. She looked confident, self-assured. She walked right up to me, pulling me into a hug, pressing against me just a little longer than necessary. Her scent, a mix of something sweet and floral, lingered as she stepped back, and for a moment, I felt something strange. Like my mind couldn't quite reconcile the image of this young woman with the memories of the girl I used to know. I shook it off, telling myself it was just the surprise of seeing her grown up. We sat down together, catching up, and she asked me questions about my life, my work, my apartment. She laughed at everything I said, her eyes never leaving mine, and I could feel this tension building, something I didn't want to acknowledge. Every so often, I'd catch her looking at me with this intensity that made my stomach twist, but I pushed it down, refusing to let myself believe that it was anything more than a friendly reunion. Part 3, the poolside realization. The next day, the heat was unbearable, so we all headed to the pool. My parents had set up a couple of loungers under the shade, drinks in hand, ready to enjoy a lazy afternoon. My brother settled in with his usual indifference, more interested in his phone than the pool, so it was just me and her. The pool had always been a special place for us, a place of memories. I remembered teaching her to swim when she was little, holding her hand as she waded in, her laughter echoing off the water. But this time felt different, like the air itself was charged with something I couldn't quite place. As we got ready, my niece emerged in a bikini that was anything but innocent. It wasn't just that it fit her well, it was the way she wore it, with this effortless confidence that seemed almost intentional. She stretched out on the lounger next to me, her skin glistening under the sun, and I felt my face heat up as she adjusted her swimsuit, glancing at me with a smirk that I couldn't quite read. I tried to focus on the scenery, on the laughter of my parents in the background, but my attention kept drifting back to her. She caught my eye, and I quickly looked away, feeling this strange guilt settle over me. Then, as if sensing my discomfort, she slid off her lounger, stretched right in front of me, and turned to me with a mischievous smile. "Bet you didn't expect me to look like this, huh?" she said, her voice light, almost teasing, but there was something darker there, something that made my heart race. I forced a laugh, trying to play it cool, but inside, I was falling apart. Every look, every touch felt loaded, like there was something unspoken between us, something I was terrified to acknowledge. I kept telling myself it was all in my head, that this was just a normal family moment, but the way she looked at me made me question everything. Part 4, The Midnight Knock. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I lay awake, my mind replaying the events of the day. I couldn't shake the image of her at the pool, the way she'd looked at me, the way her hand had lingered on my arm when she laughed. I was restless, my thoughts racing in a way that felt foreign, unsettling. I kept telling myself it was wrong, that these thoughts were something I had to bury, but the more I tried to ignore them, the stronger they became. Then, around 3 a.m., I heard a soft knock on my door. I froze, my heart pounding as I watched the door slowly creak open. She stepped into the room, her silhouette framed by the dim hallway light, and I felt my stomach twist as I realized she was wearing nothing but a loose shirt and tiny shorts that left little to the imagination. She looked at me, her eyes dark, intense, and I could feel my heart race as she stepped closer, her voice a soft whisper as she said, "Uncle, I need to talk to you." I pretended to be asleep, hoping she'd leave, but instead, she sat down on the edge of the bed, her hand resting on my shoulder as she gently shook me. I opened my eyes, looking up at her, and in that moment, I knew this wasn't just a casual chat. Her face was flushed, her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite read, something raw and vulnerable. She climbed onto the bed, crossing her legs as she sat next to me, her face inches from mine, and started talking in this soft, hesitant voice. She told me she'd missed me, that she'd thought about me more than she should, that she'd been waiting for the right moment to tell me how she felt. Her words were careful, chosen, like she was revealing a secret she'd been holding onto for years. Then she took a deep breath and confessed that she hadn't been able to feel attracted to anyone else because, in her mind, I was the one she wanted. She didn't try to sugarcoat it. She looked me straight in the eyes and said she'd been waiting, holding onto this feeling, hoping that one day she could tell me. Part 5, The Confession. Then, she straddled me, her hands on my chest, her face inches from mine. She looked at me, her voice barely above a whisper as she said, "I know it's crazy, but I don't want love, I just want you." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, and I felt this overwhelming mix of emotions I couldn't control. Part of me wanted to push her away, to tell her this was insane, but another part of me was captivated, drawn in by her honesty, her vulnerability. She wasn't asking for romance, for love, she was asking for something raw, something that went beyond words. I looked at her, trying to find the right words, but all I could manage was, "What are you talking about? This is insane." She looked hurt, like she'd crossed a line she couldn't uncross, and for a moment, I thought she was going to leave. But instead, she stayed, her eyes filled with something desperate, something pleading. I told her this was wrong, that she deserved someone who could give her real love, someone she didn't have to hide with. She pulled back, her face falling as she mumbled, "I thought you'd understand." Then she slipped off the bed, leaving the room without another sound. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, my mind spinning. It was as if everything I thought I knew had just shattered, and I didn't know how to put the pieces back together. Part of me felt a strange sense of relief that she'd left, but another part of me ached with the unresolved tension, with the weight of everything unsaid. For hours, I lay there replaying her words, her touch, the look in her eyes. The honesty of her confession was haunting, like she'd pulled back a curtain on something forbidden, something we were both terrified to acknowledge, but couldn't deny. I kept telling myself that this was just a moment of confusion, that she'd move on, that I'd move on. But the feeling in my gut told me that this wasn't over. She'd unlocked something, stirred feelings that I was ashamed to admit even to myself. Part 6, The Morning After. The next morning, I avoided her. I got up early, slipping out of the house before anyone else woke up, and went for a long walk, hoping that some fresh air would help me clear my head. I found myself down by the lake near my parents' house, staring out at the water, watching the ripples stretch across the surface. It felt like my mind was a mirror of that water. On the surface, everything looked calm, but beneath, there were currents I couldn't control. I kept trying to justify it to myself, to find some way to make sense of it. I told myself that it was just a product of circumstances, of both of us being in this strange, isolated space. I wanted to believe that she just had a moment of vulnerability, that maybe her feelings were more innocent than they seemed. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Her confession had been too raw, too intentional, too planned. She'd been waiting to tell me, holding onto these feelings, and now that she'd spoken them aloud, there was no going back. When I finally returned to the house, my mom and dad were in the kitchen, making breakfast, and I did my best to act normal, to pretend like nothing had happened. I kept glancing at the stairs, half expecting her to come down, but part of me dreaded it. I didn't know how I'd face her, how I'd look her in the eyes after what had happened. Part 7, Avoidance and Silence. The rest of the day was a blur. My niece stayed in her room, barely coming out except for a few moments here and there. I could tell that my parents and brother noticed something was off, but they didn't say anything. Maybe they assumed it was just the usual family tension, or maybe they sensed that this was something different. I felt their eyes on me, questioning, but I avoided them, keeping my answers short, doing everything I could to keep from being alone with her. Every time I passed her in the hallway or caught a glimpse of her in the kitchen, my heart would race. She barely looked at me. Her gaze fixed on the floor, her expression unreadable. It was like she'd built a wall between us, and I couldn't tell if it was out of shame, anger, or something else. But that only made it harder for me. I wanted to reach out, to tell her that I understood, that I didn't judge her, but every time I tried, the words died in my throat. That night, I stayed up late again, hoping that maybe she'd come back, that we could talk this through. But she didn't. I was left alone with my thoughts, the silence of the house pressing down on me, reminding me of everything that had happened, of everything that I couldn't forget. Part 8, A Second Confession. 2 days later, it finally happened. I was sitting outside, watching the sunset, when she came out and sat down next to me. For a long time, we just sat there in silence, watching the sky turn shades of pink and orange, neither of us daring to speak. Then, without looking at me, she whispered, "I'm sorry." Her voice was so soft, so broken, that it made my chest ache. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded, letting her continue. She told me that she'd been holding onto these feelings for years, that she knew it was wrong but couldn't help it. She told me how she'd always looked up to me, how I'd been the one stable thing in her life when everything else was falling apart. And then, as she grew older, those feelings changed, became something she couldn't understand. She didn't want love, she didn't want romance, she just wanted to feel close to someone who made her feel safe, someone she could trust completely. Her confession was like a weight lifting off her shoulders, but it felt like that same weight was shifting onto mine. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her that I understood, but I knew that any words I said would only make things worse. We sat there until the sun had dipped below the horizon, the darkness settling around us, neither of us daring to break the silence. Part 9, The Decision. After that night, I knew I had to make a choice. I couldn't keep living in this limbo, pretending that everything was normal when it clearly wasn't. I decided to leave early, cutting my vacation short and telling my parents that work had come up unexpectedly. They were disappointed, of course, but they didn't question it, and I could tell that my niece was relieved. She barely looked at me as I packed up, her expression carefully blank, as if she'd already accepted that this was the end. As I drove away, I felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, guilt, sadness, even a hint of regret. I knew that leaving was the right thing to do, that staying would only make things worse. But part of me felt like I was running away, abandoning her when she needed me most. I wanted to believe that she'd move on, that she'd find someone who could give her the kind of love she deserved. But a small, selfish part of me couldn't shake the feeling that I'd left something unfinished, something that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Part 10, Reflection and Regret. Now that I'm back in my own space, back to my life, the whole thing feels like a dream, like something that happened to someone else. But the memories are still there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to pull me back. I keep replaying that night, wondering if I could have handled it differently, if there was a way to keep her close without crossing a line. But deep down, I know that this was inevitable, that our relationship could never go back to what it was. I haven't spoken to her since I left, and I don't know if I ever will. Part of me wants to reach out, to see if she's okay, but I know that opening that door again would only make things harder. So here I am, left with the memories, with the weight of everything that happened, and the knowledge that I'll never have the answers I'm looking for. I came here hoping for advice, for some kind of closure, but I'm starting to realize that maybe there is no closure for something like this.